Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 236, Linda Bentley. Linda Lyons Bentley was born on the 30th of May 1907 in Alpha Queensland, west of Emerald, to Phoebe Catherine Bentley. She was the oldest of Phoebe's children. It seems James Patrick Lyons was her father. Her middle name also strongly indicates that this was the case. On the 29th of June 1907, so only a month after Linda's birth, in the Western Champion and General Advertiser for the Central Western Districts at Barcaldine in Queensland. At the police court on Friday morning, a case of child desertion was set down between Phoebe Catherine Bentley and James Patrick Lyons. Mr. R.F. Lyons appeared for the complainant and Mr. R.J. McCulloch for the defendant, who pleaded not guilty. Mr. Lyons said he offered no evidence as he was instructed that certain evidence upon which his client had relied was not available. On Mr. McCulloch's application, the case was dismissed with £2 2s costs. No alternative was asked for. Mr. McCulloch applied for his certificate of dismissal. Mr. Lyons objected on the grounds that it would block the complainant summoning again, which was her intention. The defendant's solicitor did not press the application, which was not granted. James Lyons was only 18 when Linda was born, and Phoebe was 20. James Patrick Lyons' death notice was in the Longreach Leader on the 25th of October 1941. And it stated that James Patrick Lyons was aged 72 and for many years in the employ of Mr. Fothergill at Barcaldine as a carter. In his younger days, Mr. Lyons was a notable horseman and rode in steeplechase races in the south. About 40 years ago, he met with a serious accident, falling from a horse while mustering in the Alpha district. This necessitated his retirement from station work. So it seems that James Lyons did not marry after his relationship with Phoebe and the birth of Linda. Phoebe claimed that her next child, Frank Alexander, Bentley's father, was a local grazier, and she sued for breach of promise when he didn't marry her. On the 19th of April 1913, in the Western Champion and General Advertiser for the Central Western Districts, a Barcaldine newspaper, a breach of promise case. Sir Arthur Rutledge dealt with a breach of promise case at the District Court at Rockhampton last week, the parties being a suit of breach of promise of marriage brought by Phoebe Catherine Bentley of Alpha, aged 26 years, against Frank Clues, a grazier. The plaintiff claimed £1,000 damages. This case was peculiar in its way. It was that of faith, confidence and trust. There were no amorous letters read to amuse the gallery, neither were there any denials on the part of the defendant that he refused at any time to marry the plaintiff. On the reverse, on 2 occasions were preparations made for the marriage. On the first occasion, the defendant failed to appear, saying he had no time. On the second occasion, he appeared after 8 o'clock, and the clergyman advised the parties to appear the next morning. They did, with the exception of the defendant, whose plaintiff did not see until 3 weeks after. She then asked the defendant what he was going to do and what she was going to do, she being in trouble to him. He said she had better go and stay with her parents. She said she could not do that. He then said good night and left. She next saw him in the March when he gave her money for maternity expenses. The child was born on the 19th of July 1909. She saw the defendant on 2 occasions after her confinement, and she each time reminded him of his promise to marry her. He always said he could not marry her just then. She took a house in Alpha and lived there with her 2 children. The eldest was by a man at Barcaldine, and supported herself by washing and sewing and the assistance from her brother. His Honour asked, "Why didn't you throw scalding water on him when he came to your house? It was your house. You would have been entitled to do so after the way he had seduced you and left you." Mr. Allen for the plaintiff said she was passionately in love with the defendant all the time. He was visiting her at the house in Alpha, but not frequently. Every time he came, she reminded him of his promise to marry her. And His Honour said, "And weren't you convinced by this time that he was a rogue and cheat and had no intention of marrying you?" Mr. Allen said she was madly in love with him, and that accounts for it. She again became intimate with the defendant in June 1911, and telling the defendant of her condition, he said, "We will get married before Christmas." Eventually, after asking the defendant several times to marry her, he said he couldn't, and when she pressed him, he said, "I am a married man. I was married in Brisbane."
She told the defendant what she thought of him. She heard something later and asked the defendant if it was a fact that he was going to marry a girl named Gable. He said no. Everyone says so, said the plaintiff. He replied, if there was not another woman in the world, I would not marry Katie Gable. You know, if I could, I would marry you. On the 25th of November, or a week later, the defendant married Kate Gable in Barcaldine. The defendant was 27 years old on the 10th of December. The defendant had supported his 2 children, which she bore him. The defendant had a selection of 5,000 acres adjoining Creek Farm, and he practically managed his father's business. He'd had the selection for 3 years. She was claiming £1,000 from the defendant as damages for his breach in not marrying her. She had suffered great wrong at his hands, and her chances of marrying had diminished. To his honour, she always believed that the defendant intended to marry her. She was always fond of him. She did not believe he would prove a worthless rascal and scoundrel. He was always telling her that they would be married. His Honour, in summing up to the jury, said they would have to believe the plaintiff's story. The defendant had not even troubled to attend the court to fight the matter or to test the claim of the plaintiff. There was nothing in the story that suggested contradiction. The defendant had taken advantage of the weakness of the woman and, under the promise of marriage, had gained his ends. He never intended to carry out his promise to marry her. The jury retired and 5 minutes later returned into the court, where the foreman stated that they had assessed the damages at £250 and costs. Phoebe had a 3rd child, Stanley, on the 3rd of March 1912, but it seems it was not registered until 1928. Stanley used his stepfather's surname throughout his life, but his future stepfather was not living with or married to Phoebe when he was listed in the 1913 census. Phoebe married George Henry Boyington on the 21st of November 1915 at Mount Morgan in Queensland. George had been born in England and they had 5 children together. George and Phoebe were living together in Mount Morgan in 1934. And getting back to Linda. On the 23rd of November 1922, for stealing 1 gold ring, 1 skirt and 1 blouse valued at £8, the property of Clarice Bedford. She pled guilty and was convicted and committed into the care of the State Children's Department until she reached the age of 18 years. Even under the age of 18, she used an alias, Vera Dampier. On the 14th of January 1926, in the Brisbane Telegraph. Looking for jail, young woman's plight, 3 charges of theft. I think she is looking for jail, said Sub-Inspector Head in the police court this morning. He was referring to Beryl Violet Johnston, aged 19 years, who was brought before Mr W. Harris on 3 charges of theft. The charges were that on the 8th of January at Brisbane, where she stole a dress at £4, the property of Annie Webb. On the 8th of January, she stole a hat valued at £1 and 1 shilling, the property of Jane Collins. And on the 11th of January, she stole £2 of property from Lily Neville. On the 8th of January, the sub-inspector stated that the defendant was convicted on 4 charges of theft and ordered her to enter her own recognizance of £5 to come up for sentence when called upon. On the 2nd and 4th charges, she was convicted and not punished, and on the 3rd, she was ordered to make restitution of £4 10 shillings in default of 1 month's imprisonment and was allowed 6 weeks to pay. At the time, she had no home. The Salvation Army people at Toowong agreed to take her in. She was sent there, but on her way, she called at Mrs. Webb's home at Toowong and told her that her parents had both been buried in the Toowong cemetery and she wished to be near their graves. Mrs. Webb took her in, but on the following day, the defendant disappeared, with the articles mentioned in the 2nd and 1st charges. On January the 11th, the defendant went to the Church of England shelter in Mary Street, where she was previously known. She went into the office on the pretence of getting ink and paper, broke into the cash box and took the money mentioned in the 3rd charge. Mr. Harris said, "You seem to have been robbing people who have befriended you. It is a very serious matter and I sentence you to 1 month's imprisonment on each charge, the sentences being concurrent." And 2 months later, on the 11th of March 1926, in the Brisbane Daily Mail, girls sent to jail. Discharged from the Brisbane jail on the 14th of February, Beryl Violet Johnston, 19, a domestic, went to a boarding house at South Brisbane. On the 17th of February, during the absence of one of the lodgers, James Irwin, she took from his room a ring valued at 25 shillings and a bank book. She wrote a letter purporting to be from Irwin, asking the manager of the bank to give the bearer £15. She was paid the £15 and left Brisbane, returning a few days later when she went to a boarding house where she stole a ring valued at £20, the property of Lily Witherwick. She then sold it for 15 shillings. The girl was arrested for stealing these articles. When she was in custody, it was found that in October, she got a loan of a dress from Amber Streeting, saying she wanted to get one made like it. She wore the dress for some time and then destroyed it. Johnson appeared in the City Police Court yesterday and pled guilty to stealing the ring and money belonging to Irwin, the ring belonging to Lily Weatherwick, and the dress belonging to Amber Streeting, valued at £3 3 shillings. On the first two charges, she was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment, sentences to be cumulative, and on the third charge, she was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment, with the sentence to be concurrent with the other sentences. Then 7 months later, on the 26th of October 1926, in the Rockhampton Evening News. Bad record, and at 19 too. Young woman before court. Described as a woman with a bad record, Hazel Bedford, otherwise known as Linda Bentley, 19, who says she belongs in Mount Morgan, was charged in the police court this morning with stealing a quantity of ladies' clothing and a blank cheque form. The charges were, on the 26th of August at Rockhampton, stealing 2 ladies' frocks, valued at £8 8 shillings and 8 pence, the property of Margaret Curtin. A second charge on September the 3rd at Rockhampton, stealing a lady's overcoat, a black crepe dress, a night dress, a pair of ladies' stockings and a red and black coloured print dress, valued at £6 and 10 shillings, the property of Lillian Blackwell. The third charge on the 3rd of September at Rockhampton, stealing a leather suitcase, valued at £4 4 shillings, the property of Mona Gibson. And the fourth charge between the 17th and the 24th of October at Edmonstowe Station, stealing a blank cheque form valued at 1 pence, the property of John R.C. The defendant, who was 19 years of age, was attired in one of the dresses she'd stolen. She pled guilty to all 4 counts. Senior Sergeant Fowler, who prosecuted, said that the practice of the defendant was to go around different boarding houses, take a room, then decamp with other people's property. The first of the 4 offences was committed at the Gables boarding house. Margaret Curtin was staying there, as was the defendant. During the day, the complainant went out and on returning found that her room had been disturbed, whilst on the floor was an old brown dress that did not belong to her. The defendant left the boarding house that day and had not been traced until yesterday, when she admitted to the theft, having changed her own dress for one of the complainants. The second offence was committed in similar circumstances on the 3rd of September. The defendant took a room at a boarding house in Elmer Street, and after entering the rooms of Lillian Blackwell and Mona Gibson, she decamped with dresses in a suitcase in which to carry the dresses in. The police were advised, but the defendant had apparently left the town, for the next they heard she was at Edmonstowe Station, where she was employed as a domestic. Whilst there, she stole a cheque form from the chequebook of John R.C. and arrived in Rockhampton on Sunday morning. Yesterday morning, added the senior sergeant, the defendant went to Mr. Abdullah's shop in Denison Street to purchase some drapery and tendered a cheque for £25. Mrs. Abdullah was not to be caught napping, as she had trouble with cheques on previous occasions. So it was agreed that she was to hold the cheque and that they both meet at the Commercial Bank of Sydney when it opened at 10 o'clock. The defendant was there when Mrs. Abdullah arrived. She presented the cheque, which was purported to be signed by John R.C. The manager of the bank was doubtful about the signature, however, and asked the defendant who she was. She promptly replied, Mrs. R.C. The bank held the cheque and told the defendant to come back later. In the meantime, a wire was received by the manager of the bank from the manager of Edmonstowe Station, advising of the theft of the cheque. Shortly afterwards, the defendant was located by the police, and she admitted stealing the cheque and forging John R.C.'s signature. Senior Sergeant Fowler said further that the defendant was convicted of stealing at Blackhall in 1922 and ordered to enter into a bond of a sum of £20 if she come up for sentence within 12 months. In the same year at Rockhampton, she was committed to the care of the State Children's Department until she reached 18 years. Whilst in March of last year, she took another false step at Brisbane, where she was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment for stealing on 3 counts, and she was also fined £4 and 10 shillings, with the alternative of a month's imprisonment on another charge of stealing. The judge asked the defendant what she had to say. You have a fearful record, he added. The defendant had nothing to say other than that she would like to make an opportunity of making restitution. She was asked, were you employed as a domestic when you committed the thefts in Brisbane? No, I was staying at that place. Where are your parents? The respondent replied that they were in Mount Morgan and she had visited them in July. If given a chance to make restitution, she had a friend out in Blackhall who would help her. Further question, the defendant said that she was in a state orphanage at Rockhampton for 2 years and then transferred to a home in Brisbane for not behaving herself. The magistrate said, "It is a sad case. What is going to become of you if you continue on like this?" The defendant meekly replied that she did not know. In court, she did not appear to realise her serious position. The magistrate sentenced the defendant to 6 weeks' imprisonment on each charge, the sentences to be cumulative. And in 1926, she featured in the Police Gazette under Beryl Violet Johnson, alias Linda Bentley, alias Vera Damper, alias Janet Walsh, alias Hazel Bedford, and the outline of the previous misdemeanours was covered in that Gazette notice. And on the 6th of August 1927, young woman sentenced, stole rings from employer. In the Brisbane Telegraph, Linda Bentley, 22, a domestic, on remand, appeared in the police court this morning, charged with stealing at Brisbane on the 21st of July 2 gold rings valued at £7, the property of Hubert David Morris. She pled guilty. Senior Sergeant Maloney, who prosecuted, said that the defendant on the date in question was employed as a domestic by the complainant and in that capacity had access to all the rooms of the house. She was discharged from her employment and the rings were missed after she'd left. A complaint was made to the police and the defendant was located at Lanesborough, where she had been sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment on a charge of stealing and was now on her way to Brisbane jail. The rings, subject of the present charge, had been pawned in a Wickham Street pawn shop. Mr Ferguson imposed a fine of £10 in default of 3 months' imprisonment to commence at the expiration of the present sentence. And in 1927, in the Police Gazette, Linda Bentley, alias Hazel Bedford, alias Beryl Violet Johnson, alias Vera Dampier, alias Janet Walsh, at Landsborough on the 3rd of August 1927, stealing £12, the property of Jessie Grant of Malini, fined £5 in order to make restitution of £6, 19 shillings and 4 pence, in default 3 months' imprisonment. On the 11th of February 1928, in the Brisbane Telegraph, theft by woman, 2 months' imprisonment. Linda Bentley, aged 21, pled guilty before Mr J. Stuart Burge, police magistrate, in the police court this morning to a charge of having stolen at Brisbane on the 8th of February an umbrella, a vanity bag, a string of beads, 2 money boxes, £2 and 8 shillings in money, with a total value of £4, 2 shillings and 6 pence, the property of John Wilson Schlief. Detective Maloney said the theft was committed while the defendant was in the employ of Schlief as a housekeeper. Only the vanity bag has been recovered. The defendant said the umbrella was stolen from her at the post office and that with the exception of the money which she had spent, she had thrown the other articles away. The magistrate said that although the defendant was only 21 years of age, she'd had 10 previous convictions and seemed incorrigible. The sentence of 2 months' imprisonment with hard labour was imposed. Linda Bentley was also charged with having stolen a gold wristlet watch, an overcoat and a pair of shoes, the total value of £7, the property of Elizabeth Lawson. She was remanded until Thursday. And then on Thursday the 16th of February 1928 in the Brisbane Telegraph, 3 charges of theft, young woman sentenced. In the police court this afternoon before Mr Burge, police magistrate, Linda Bentley, 21, pled guilty to 3 charges of stealing from boarding houses. It was stated that on the 1st of February at Spring Hill, she stole a lady's overcoat, a dress, a lady's gold wristlet watch and a pair of shoes, a total value of £7, the property of Elizabeth Lawson. On the 1st of January, she stole a purse and 12 shillings in money, a total value of 17 shillings, the property of May Innes. And on the 10th of January, she stole a dress valued at £2, the property of Edith Marlowe. Sub-Inspector Locke said that the defendant obtained accommodation at various boarding houses and then left the next day. After her departure, it was found that the property, which was the subject of the charges, was missing. The defendant was at present serving a sentence for stealing and had 21 previous convictions. On each charge, the defendant was sentenced to 1 month's imprisonment, the sentences to be cumulative and to commence at the expiration of her present sentence. And again, she features in the police court at Sandgate, stolen from a dwelling at Shorncliffe Sandgate between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m. on the 5th instant, the property of Temperance Taylor, 1 18-carat gold half-hoop engagement ring set with 4 or 5 diamonds, 1 plain 18-carat gold wedding ring, one lady's black leather handbag, about 7 by 5 inches, 4 compartments, containing 2 10-shilling notes, £1 in mixed silver, 1 railway season ticket, number 8081 Sandgate to Brisbane, in favour of T. Taylor, 1 pair of light pink silk stockings, 2 silver teaspoons, Wingfield wing stamped, valued at £30. Suspicion attaches to a woman who gave the name of Leslie Broadhurst, who arrived at Sandgate on the 30th and engaged a room from the complainant. On the 5th, she accompanied the complainant to the beach, and while the complainant was bathing, she disappeared, and upon returning to her residence, she found the above-mentioned property, and the suspect was missing. The photograph of Linda Bentley, discharged prisoner, from the Police Gazette 1928 has been identified as that of the suspect. When last seen, suspect was wearing a striped lavender dress. So on the 1st of August 1928, in the Rockhampton Morning Bulletin, stealing 2 charges, young woman sentenced. Although only 21 years of age, Hazel Bedford, of rather good appearance, has had considerable criminal experience during her young life. To date, she's been convicted on 13 occasions, each one registered for thieving. In the police court yesterday, she pled guilty to 2 further charges of thieving. On Monday night, she was arrested on a charge of having, on July the 12th, stolen a gold ring and a tie pin valued at £23, the property of Andrew Sweeney. The second charge was that she stole £3, 10 shillings and 6 pence, the property of John Leslie MacArthur of West Rockhampton, between the 29th and the 30th of July. Explaining the facts of the case, Senior Sergeant McIver stated that Sweeney, who was an old miner, came from Rubyvale early in the month and stayed at the Forbes boarding house. A few days later, the defendant arrived and stayed at the same place. On the date in question, he showed some of the boarders a valuable ring and a tie pin, and the defendant informed him that she had a friend at the hospital who would buy the ring from him. They agreed to see whether her friend would buy the ring for £20. If he did not do so, she was to return the property to Sweeney. However, when she returned, she had neither the ring nor the £20, and she'd made the excuse that she left it at a friend's place in Campbell Street. Sweeney then informed her that if she did not return the property by 10 o'clock the following morning, he would take certain action, and the defendant cleared out. She remained in hiding for some time, and it was not until the previous night that she was arrested. Plainclothes policeman Solgaard investigated the matter and recovered the property at a pawn shop, where the articles had been pawned for £3. In reply to the magistrate, the defendant said she had no explanation to make and could give no reason for her conduct. Her parents resided at Mount Morgan, but she could not stay at home as she did not agree with her stepfather. She had been home during the last fortnight. The magistrate asked, "Is there anyone who would take charge of her and keep her straight?" Senior Sergeant McIver said, "I am certain nobody would or could." The magistrate said, "It is one of the sad things that come before the court, a young woman turning into a common jailbird." The magistrate refused the defendant's appeal to impose a fine, intimating that he thought it best to send her to jail and give her time to think over things and make a fresh start, and he sentenced her to 3 months' imprisonment. In connection with the second charge, the senior sergeant stated that on Sunday night last, the defendant secured a room at the complainant's home at West Rockhampton. In the room she occupied, there was a drawer of which the complainant kept the proceeds of a church collection. The money was there prior to the defendant occupying the room, but was missing after she left. She made a complaint to the police that morning. On being arrested, the defendant had 10 shillings and 6 pence in her possession. She was sentenced to a further month's imprisonment, the sentence being concurrent. The property was restored to the owners in both cases. And on the 18th of December 1928 in the Brisbane Courier, Linda Bentley, 23, domestic duties, was charged with having on November the 28th at Rockhampton stolen £16 and 10 shillings in notes, the property of Roy Sheriff. On the 5th of December at Sandgate, stealing a gold ring set with diamonds, a wedding ring and a lady's handbag, 2 railway passes, £1 in cash, total value £26, the property of Temperance Taylor, and stolen at Brisbane on the 14th of November, a lady's silk dress, a pair of silk stockings, a pair of boots and a towel, valued at £5, 18 shillings and 2 pence, the property of Hilda Smith, and a fourth charge on November the 14th at Brisbane, having stolen a money box containing 11 shillings and 5 pence, total value of 12 shillings and 1 pence, the property of Sydney John Turner. The defendant asked for a remand. Sub-Inspector Lip, having no objection to the case, remanded it for a week. On the 4th of June 1929 in the Brisbane Daily Standard, Linda Bentley, 22, who stole articles of clothing from her roommate in an Edward Street boarding house on the 27th of May, was sentenced in the police court this morning to 3 months' imprisonment. The stolen property belonged to Louisa Simpson. Detective Sergeant McGrath said the young woman, who had entered a plea of guilty, had a long record of stealing and had only recently been discharged from jail. And on the 13th of June 1929 in the Brisbane Daily Standard, young woman with 32 convictions. It is dreadful, says the magistrate. A young woman named Linda Bentley, 23, appeared in the police court this morning, charged that on the 3rd of June she stole a lady's overcoat valued at £3, the property of Mary Fewen. She has a number of convictions recorded against her. She is at present serving 3 months' imprisonment for stealing. Pleading guilty to the latest charge, she was bound over on a bond of £10 to be of good behaviour for 6 months, on her undertaking to spend that time after her release under the care of the Salvation Army. Senior Sergeant McGrath stated that the complainant lived with her mother at a boarding house in which the defendant had a room. On the 2nd of June, the defendant asked her for a loan of a coat. The complainant did so on the understanding it was to be returned the same night. The defendant returned the coat, but when she left the next morning, she took the coat with her. When she was arrested on other charges, the defendant was wearing this coat, which she maintained she'd bought for £1.10. Later, however, she admitted to the theft. Is there no possible chance of doing anything with her? She seems to have been in jail since the end of 1927. Senior Sergeant McGrath said, "This seems to be her failing, Your Worship. I am told that when she is in employment, she is a good worker." The magistrate said it is dreadful. She's only 23 and has 32 charges for stealing. A Salvationist in court stated they had tried to help the defendant as much as possible and they would like to take her into a home until such time that she could feel strong enough to go out into the world and resist these things. The magistrate, on defendant undertaking to do this, bound her over. However, only 4 months later, on the 9th of October 1929, in the Brisbane Courier, Linda Bentley was presented in the police court yesterday on 9 charges of stealing a quantity of clothing and money from different city and suburban boarding houses. The defendant pleaded guilty to each charge. The total value of the goods was £54 and the total money stolen was £1 1 shilling. Senior Sergeant McIver, who prosecuted, stated the defendant had an unenviable record and had only been released from jail on the 17th of August. It had been her custom to go to boarding houses and tell a story that she had a sick relative in hospital or that she was employed at a city cafe. Usually she stayed only a few hours, remarking as she left that she would return shortly. After she left, the property was missed. Very little of the property has been recovered and it was damaged to such an extent that it was practically valueless. The defendant said she had nothing to say, and Mr. Tregear remarked that he had given the defendant a chance previously and that her record was a frightful one and imposed a sentence of 2 months' imprisonment with hard labour on each charge, the sentences to be cumulative. She next appeared on the 22nd of January 1931 in the Brisbane Telegraph. Linda Bentley, 24, was remanded until the 27th of January in the police court today. The defendant was charged, firstly, that on the 17th of January at Brisbane she stole a quantity of ladies' apparel valued at £2 8 shillings and 8 pence, the property of Harriet Gordon, and the second charge on the same date was she stole a suitcase valued at 3 shillings, the property of Clara Buck. When she appeared before Mr. Ferguson, the magistrate in the police court yesterday, it increased to 3 charges of theft. She pled guilty. The additional charge was on the 18th of January. She stole a raincoat valued at 15 shillings, the property of Sarah Louisa Maitland. The property was taken from houses where the defendant stayed. The suitcase and raincoat were lent to her, but she did not return them. Most of the property had been recovered. In reply to a question from Mr. Ferguson, the defendant said she was willing to be placed under the control of the Salvation Army. On the first charge, the defendant was fined £1 to include restitution of 14 shillings and 9 pence, the value of the missing property. On each of the other charges, she was discharged upon entering into a bond of £10 to appear for sentence if called upon within 6 months. The defendant left the court in company of an officer from the Salvation Army. However, only 7 months later, on the 16th of July 1931, in the Central Queensland Herald of Rockhampton, stole clothing. Linda Bentley, a young woman aged 24, was fined on 2 charges of stealing. The charges were that on the 7th she stole a quantity of wearing apparel, a suitcase and a gold bangle, valued at £6 15 shillings and 11 pence, the property of Bertha Logue, and that on the 9th she stole a quantity of wearing apparel, a hat box and a gold wristlet watch, valued at £38 and 15 shillings, the property of Helen Pearson. Bertha Logue stated that on the morning of the 7th, the defendant came to her mother's home for accommodation. She was given a room, and that night, when the witness and her mother went out, they left the defendant sitting in the dining room. On returning later in the night, they found the defendant missing, and on the following morning, the witness found the articles mentioned in the charge missing. The defendant gave the name of Thelma Thomas when she came to the house. Giving evidence on the arrest on the second charge, Constable Beatson stated that he questioned the defendant on Friday last, and she admitted to stealing the articles mentioned in the charge. Helen Pearson stated that on the 9th of the 7th, the defendant called at her mother's house and, giving the name of Peggy Danaher, she asked for a room, stating she had just come from the hospital where her mother lied seriously ill. The defendant was given a room, and she remained until the afternoon of the 9th, when she disappeared. Returning from business at 6 p.m. that day, the witness found a large quantity of clothing missing. The defendant pled guilty and elected to be dealt with summarily. Senior Sergeant Clare, who prosecuted, stated that the defendant had 15 previous convictions. The defendant said she was sorry for what she had done and asked to be dealt with leniently. The magistrate imposed a fine of £1 with the alternative of 14 days imprisonment on the first charge and £2 or a month's imprisonment on the second charge. Linda then married Arthur George New on the 27th of January 1934 at St Saviour's Church at Gladstone, Queensland. Arthur was 10 years older than Linda. He'd been married prior and his wife had died in 1931. Interestingly, in all of the census records after their marriage, even though on the marriage certificate she's named as Linda Lyons Boynton, she is listed as Hazel Dorothy. Linda and Arthur had a son, James. After she married, all of her misdemeanours seem to have disappeared. I could not find a charge for her after that time. Linda died on the 23rd of March 1974 in Rockhampton at the age of 66. She listed her mother as Phoebe Catherine Bentley and her father as George Henry Boynton. And a little on Linda's siblings to see whether she was the only child in the family that went on this path. A brother, Frank Alexander Bentley, who was born on the 19th of July 1909 in Alpha, Queensland, died on the 17th of March 1928 in Mount Morgan. He was aged only 18. He is buried with his mother, Phoebe. Stanley Boynton was born on the 2nd of March 1912 in Alpha, Queensland. He married Sarah Ida Lillian Quinn, known as Sally, in April 1934 in Jericho, Queensland. And in the Rockhampton Central Queensland Herald, it had an announcement of their marriage. At St Matthew's Church of England, Jericho, a very pretty wedding was solemnised between Stanley, eldest son of Mr and Mrs George Boynton of Mount Morgan, and Sarah Lillian, eldest daughter of Mr and Mrs James Quinn of Jericho. In 1936, Stanley was a shop assistant in Alpha, and in 1949 they were living at Monto. He then married Doris Leela Duggan after 1963, but his first wife did not pass away until 1982. Stanley died on the 14th of September 1980 in Rockhampton, aged 68. Another brother was William Alfred George Boynton, who was born on the 10th of September 1916 in Mount Morgan. He married Olive May Hanson in August 1941. He was a railway officer and by 1963 was station master at Barcaldine. He died on the 6th of November 1984 at Barcaldine, Queensland, aged 68. And Muriel Boynton was born in 1918, but she died in 1919. In the Rockhampton Morning Bulletin, it announced the accident at Mount Morgan on the 5th of December 1919. Our Mount Morgan correspondent writing last evening said that at 1:30 this afternoon, the ambulance bearers were called from the Central Hotel to Staunton Street to attend Muriel Boynton, aged 18 months, who was severely burnt on the hands through falling against a stove. First aid was rendered and the parents were advised to see a doctor. The next child was Marie Peace Boynton, who was born on the 1st of March 1919 at Mount Morgan. She married Stanley Hare in Mount Morgan in February 1939 and they had one daughter. Marie died on the 6th of October 1989 at Mount Morgan, aged 70. The next sibling was Catherine Boynton, who was born on the 8th of July 1921 in Mount Morgan. However, she was stillborn. The next sibling was Cecil Reginald Boynton, who was born on the 6th of August 1922 in Mount Morgan. He served in World War II. He married Doris Agnes Jean in Brisbane in May 1953. He was also a railway employee and they had two children. and he died on the 26th of September 1971 in Brisbane. And another sibling, Jean Adelaide Boyington, was born on the 1st of December 1925 in Mount Morgan. She married Clifford Littlemore at Mount Morgan in August 1945. Clifford worked as a pressman in Wynnum in 1949 and was a bootmaker in 1954. They had 2 daughters, and she died on the 20th of April 1997 at Wynnum, Queensland, aged 71. So it seems the rest of her family lived normal, lawful lives. But for Linda Bentley, she certainly had a run of it until she obviously married a man that she could rely on and settled her stealing ways.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.